Hey everybody, what's up? That second chord I just played in that little progression was an augmented triad. And in today's video, I'm going to show you how to learn augmented triads the right way and how to use them the right way. So without further ado, let's get started. So to learn how to construct an augmented triad, first we're going to start with the major triad, which you should all know by now after watching my other triad videos, that a major triad is constructed using a root, major, third, and a perfect fifth. The way that we construct an augmented triad is really simple. All we do is we take that major triad, we take the fifth and raise it up a half step to make it an augmented fifth, which gives us the augmented triad. So let's play that right now. We're gonna start with our major triad, C major triad. It has the notes C, E, and G. G is the fifth, and we're gonna raise that up a half step or raise it up a fret on the guitar fretboard, and it's going to look like this. So it's a kind of interesting sounding chord, and by itself it sounds kind of weird, but you'll see that in context of different chords it can sound super duper cool. So that's our C augmented triad, C, E, and G sharp instead of G natural. So that's just one version of the C augmented triad, and the right way to learn any triad or any chord is to be able to dissect it and play it all over the guitar fretboard, knowing what notes are in the chord, and be able to invert it across the guitar fretboard. So let's start inverting this C augmented chord now. What we're gonna do is we're gonna take the lowest note in the chord, which in this case is the root, and we're going to raise it up an octave, like this. So let's talk a little bit more about inverting the augmented chord for just a second. If we actually look at the intervals between all the notes in an augmented chord, they're actually all the exact same distance apart. C to E is a major third, and E to G sharp is a major third. And actually, G sharp to C, if we go up an octave to the root again, is another major third. So every single note is a major third apart in this chord. They're all the same distance apart. Therefore, actually, every single time you invert it, it's pretty much the same exact thing. All the augmented chords are kind of the same. The C augmented chord, the E augmented chord, and the G sharp augmented chord, they're all the same chord. They all have the same exact notes in it. So every time you invert this chord, you really just get another augmented chord. It's very easy, but at the same time, a little confusing when you start looking at it across the fretboard. Right now, we're still going to just think about it as a normal C augmented, and we're inverting it, and you're going to start to see that afterwards. So here we have our C augmented first inversion, and we're going to move the E up an octave to the second string, and we're going to get this C augmented second inversion, which again is also the same thing as just a G sharp augmented chord. And now finally, let's raise that G sharp up an octave to the first string. And now we're going to get this next root position C augmented triad. So let's check out that whole entire position of different C augmented triads there. When you hear all those augmented triads being played together, it kind of sounds really like dreamy and surreal. It sounds very interesting. So now that we got that position covered, the next order of business is to go up to a different position by moving our original C augmented triad up to the next inversion on the same set of strings. So what we're going to do is we're going to move C up to E, and we're going to move E up to G sharp, and we're going to move G sharp up to C. And you're going to see it's actually going to be the exact same shape because of what I just told you earlier. So C moves up to E, E moves up to G sharp, and G sharp moves up to C. And now we have this technically a C first inversion augmented triad, but it's also an E augmented triad. See, it's the exact same shape. And now that you see that, every single augmented triad shape that you learn on the guitar fretboard, if you decide to invert it up the same set of strings, they're all going to be the exact same shape. So you're going to see, actually, we're going to be able to go through this video a lot quicker than like the major and minor triads, because every single position is actually going to be the exact same shapes. So let's move that E up an octave to the third string. And now we got C augmented second inversion. Same exact shapes from before. And now let's move that G sharp up an octave to the second string. And we have another C augmented root position. And then let's move that C up an octave to the first string. So all the augmented triads in that position look like this. Again, all the exact same shapes as before. So we're going to be able to get really, really quickly through this. Let's now get the last position of the C augmented shapes by moving up every single one of the notes along the same string that they're on from the original C augmented we started on. So we're going to move E up to G sharp. G sharp moves up to C. And C moves up to E. And now we have our C augmented second inversion. All right, let's move that one up, inverted up in that position. We're going to move the G sharp up an octave. Now we're going to move the C up an octave, the second string. And now we're moving E up an octave to the first string. And back down. And we can actually do that position all the way down here, down an octave, starting from this G sharp on the sixth string on the fourth fret. So let's review all of our C augmented triads across the fretboard, starting with the one in the beginning. So congratulations, that was pretty quick. You actually know all of your C augmented triads all over the guitar fretboard because, well, basically once you learn one position, you know all of them. They're all the exact same. And that brings me to the next part of this video, which is we're going to talk about playing this one in different keys. And because of exactly what I said, actually, you don't have to memorize all these different keys, all different augmented triads, because of how symmetrical this augmented triad is. So actually, once you learn the C augmented triad, now you already know the E and the G sharp augmented triads, or you could also call it A flat augmented. It's the same exact note, just a different name for the same note. So in reality, there's actually only 4 different augmented triads that you need to know before they start kind of repeating themselves. So you need to know C augmented, you need to know C sharp or D flat augmented, and D and E flat augmented. Because once you get up to E augmented again, you go C, C sharp, D, D sharp, or E flat, and then once you get to E, guess what? Now you're back at just an inversion of your C augmented triad. So there's actually only 4 different unique augmented triads that have unique different notes in each one of them. So let's check out a couple of them just for good measure. Let's actually try that C sharp augmented triad. So we can think of it as starting from C sharp and going up a major third and another major third, or we could just think of taking our C augmented triad and moving it up a half step, moving all the shapes up a half step. So that's one thing with these kind of chords too, these augmented chords, and sometimes when you get into diminished chords and fully diminished chords and you play them in different keys, the naming of the notes can get kind of wacky. We're not going to worry too much about that, but just let's say that actually we're going to call this, instead of C sharp augmented, we'll call it D flat augmented. That'll make it a little bit easier. And the notes in this would be D flat, F, and A natural. Because a D flat major triad would have D flat, F, and A flat. And we raise the A flat up to A natural. Now we have the D flat augmented. So here would be all the inversions of the D flat augmented. And then we could start all the way up on F here. And we could go all the way down here to A natural and actually play technically the second inversion. But again, it's really just an A augmented triad, A augmented, D flat, and C sharp augmented, F augmented. They're all the exact same chord. They're all just inversions of each other. And we can also do that one up an octave as well. So you kind of get the idea. We don't have to spend too much time transposing the augmented triad all over the place because, like I said, once you know one of them, you actually know three of them. And once you know the shapes for one of them, well, you know the shapes for all of them because that's how the guitar works. The shapes, no matter what you play, the shapes are going to be the same. You just move them around the guitar fretboard. So let's talk a little bit now about how to use augmented triads, where you're going to find them in different chord progressions, and how to solo with them a little bit. So augmented triads are actually, in my experience, they're generally used as substitutes for major chords, and specifically they're used for substitutes for the 5 chord in a progression. So one of the most common chord progressions that you can play is called the 2-5-1. It sounds like this. So that was a 2-5-1 in the key of C major with D minor to G major to C major. D minor is 2, G major is 5, and C major is the 1 chord. So a lot of times, instead of just playing a G major chord, if you want to spice things up, you can play a G augmented chord like this. That's actually exactly what I did in the beginning of the video. Why does that work so well? Well, the reason is because the 5 chord in a progression, in this case the G chord, or you could actually, if you put a 7th on it, it'd be a G dominant 7th chord. That 5 chord is designed specifically to create tension that wants to resolve to the 1 chord. So when you play this, you just expect to hear that 1 chord afterwards, or 1 with a major 7, some kind of form of the 1 chord, you expect to hear it. So because this augmented chord has a lot of tension in it, you can just hear when we just play it by ourselves, like, wow, that chord is kind of strange. But because it's kind of strange, it's very, very good at increasing the amount of tension on that 5 chord a bit, and it actually adds an extra note that wants to resolve from the 5 chord to the 1 chord. So in this case, if we turn that G major chord, which has G, B, and D in it, and we raise that 5th up a half step from D to D sharp or E flat, that D sharp really, really wants to resolve up a half step on the next chord to E, like this. Da, da. And along with the other kind of resolutions that happen in our 5-to-1 progression, it just creates even more strong voice leading. You could also resolve it different ways. If you're using different kinds of more advanced voicings, you could do something like this. That actually is resolving down to a C major 9 chord. That's a little bit out of the scope of this video. But what I want you to know is that the purpose of augmented chords is to create even more tension that resolves to the 1 chord from the 5 chord. And actually, if you watch my diminished triads video, that's actually pretty much the function of diminished triads. Diminished triads and augmented triads actually are very, very similar in that way, in the way that they function, but they're two sort of different flavors. Instead of hearing something like this, that would be with a diminished chord, you get a different flavor of that tension. But they still function pretty much the same way. And the second most common way that you hear augmented chords being used is a way to kind of spice up actually the 1 chord or just a major chord in a progression with a sort of what we would call line cliche that sounds something like this. So what was I doing there? I was actually going from a C major chord to a C augmented chord to a C6 chord. And that's a little bit beyond the scope of this video, but a C6 chord is basically a C major triad where we replace the 5th with the 6th. So in this case, the notes in it are C, E, and A. So we have this movement of the 5th moving up to the sharp 5, and then the sharp 5 moves up to the 6th, and the 6 moves back down to the sharp 5. So we constantly have that movement with the 5th in the chord that kind of sounds a little bit more interesting than just sitting on a regular major chord the whole time. Again, it actually creates a little bit of tension, but not in the exact same way that you create tension on the 5 chord. It's a very, very temporary, quick amount of tension that still sounds very tasteful, and it just sounds like there's some movement going on more than anything. It creates movement when you really want to sit on 1 chord, but you're saying, how can I make this a little bit more interesting than just sitting on the exact same chord and playing that chord verbatim the entire time? A really famous example of augmented chords in a song is the song Oh Darlin' by the Beatles. It opens with an E augmented triad that has this low E in the bass actually, and it resolves to an A major chord. And then there's a bunch of chord progressions that happen in the key of A major, but the point is that chord just sounds really, really cool. Go listen to that song and you hear it, it's super obvious that E augmented triad that takes us right in nicely to that chord progression in the key of A. Because again, that E augmented triad is substituting for an E dominant 7 chord. Normally you might hear something like this. But instead, they decided, let's spice it up a little bit. Let's throw an E augmented triad. And finally, let's talk about soloing over the augmented triad. So a lot of times, you're not going to see augmented chords written into the chord progression of a song. A lot of times, you have to understand the function of that augmented triad, and you have to be able to basically substitute it in at your discretion. So if you were playing over this chord progression, D minor to G major to C, you might actually just throw in that augmented chord yourself. So I might play some kind of line that goes like this. So I just played off the D minor arpeggio, then I played off a G augmented arpeggio, and then went to the C major arpeggio on the C major chord. So for right now, I think it's best to just practice switching between C major arpeggios and the G augmented triad. So you should be used to how that augmented triad resolves to the 1 chord, not just playing it by itself, but seeing how does it resolve. So if we just take this little G augmented triad here, and then get the closest C major triad, which is right here, you can actually see 2 of the notes move up. And then if we do different inversions, the same thing. The B and the E flat or the D sharp move up a half step. 5 and 1 or 1 and 5, but substituting in that augmented sound whenever you want on any 5 chord. So the most important part of this, however, is even though we're focusing a little bit on this actual augmented triad, the rhythm is still the most important thing. So make sure you're playing with some good time. Play some quarter notes like 1, 2, 3, 4. Practice switching between those 2 chords. You might want to go slower than I just did right now. You might want to literally just go like this slow, like. And as you can see, actually, even though that seems really, really easy and really slow, that sounds like really, really interesting. You hear that motion between those 2 chords in the single note lines I'm playing. I'm not playing chords. I'm not just going. Although that actually sounds really cool too, in my opinion. But this is how you start to learn how to create solos where you can actually hear the harmony in your solos by practicing using the arpeggios over a chord progression and soloing with just those arpeggios, and then gradually starting to add in more notes, like notes that are from the key, etc., etc., etc. But the whole point is that you're actually outlining the harmony in your solo, which makes it sound a lot more interesting. So make sure you have your major, minor, diminished, and augmented triads down. If you want to check out how to learn those other triads, look at these 2 videos right here, and make sure you go to Jamsville.com and pick up the Jamsville GPS Fretboard Fundamentals course. You are going to be so glad that you did. You're not even going to be able to recognize you're playing when you're done with that course. So until next time, listen, learn, and jam.